Creating Visual Studio Cloud Business Applications for SharePoint 2013 using AngularJS. I'm Michael Washington. You can buy my book at the lightswitchhelpwebsite.com. On our agenda today, we will first cover what is Visual Studio LightSwitch. Why would you want to use Angular with LightSwitch? We will then cover creating Angular SharePoint applications using LightSwitch. We will then cover how to post to the SharePoint newsfeed. And finally, we will cover creating Word documents in SharePoint. First, what is Visual Studio LightSwitch? Visual Studio LightSwitch allows you to create HTML applications. It creates single-page applications, SPA applications, and it uses jQuery Mobile. It implements an AngularJS-style JavaScript binding framework, and it communicates with the back-end server using OData. Now, why would you want to use AngularJS with LightSwitch? The first reason is that you need 100% control of the UI. The disadvantage of LightSwitch is that it uses jQuery Mobile, which is fine for your mobile applications. However, sometimes you need 100% control of the UI. In this case, using another UI technology such as Angular is preferable. You need to implement security. All security must be implemented on the server side. You want to use LightSwitch for the administrative screens. You can create applications, as we will demonstrate, where you can have some of the screens in Angular and some of the screens in LightSwitch. You want to build an OData service layer for use with other applications. When you use LightSwitch, you automatically get an OData service layer. And finally, you want to speed up development. How does LightSwitch work? When using LightSwitch with Angular, you have the Angular web page. It then communicates through OData to the LightSwitch business layer, which then connects to your database. We will now cover creating an Angular SharePoint application using LightSwitch. When we start running our application, it will make us log in to our SharePoint website. We'll log into the SharePoint website and the Angular application will appear. We'll see any existing task and we'll be able to click Add New to create a new task. We will also implement business rules. For example, one rule is that a task cannot be named New Task. We can enter a task name, its completion status, and it will show up in the list. We can click on an existing task and we can edit it. In addition, we'll show how we can also have the LightSwitch application running at the same time against the same data. We'll see the tasks show up in the LightSwitch application, and just as with the Angular application, we can edit the task. To demonstrate that the LightSwitch application is running against the same data, we can return to the Angular application and any data will be exactly the same. We can also delete a task. Switch. To show how this project is created, we will first create the project. We will then add the data source and business logic. We will then create the LightSwitch HTML client screens, and then we'll create the Angular screens. We'll then configure the Angular page to load, and we'll then match the styles to the SharePoint site. We will then add the SharePoint Chrome, which is the logo and the toolbar. First, we'll create the project. We'll create a cloud business app. A cloud business app is a LightSwitch application designed to run on SharePoint. It will then ask us to connect to our developer site. If we do not have a developer site, there's a link that will show you how to get one, or how to configure your existing SharePoint site to allow you to have a developer site. The projects will be created. There will be 4 projects created. The first project is the configuration project, which also contains a publishing wizard. Next is the HTML client project, which contains only JavaScript. The next project is the ASP.NET project. This is a normal ASP.NET project which allows you to reference any DLLs or run any sort of ASP.NET code that you would normally run. This is also where we'll put our Angular pages. And then finally you have the SharePoint configuration project. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll select File, then New Project. We'll select the Office SharePoint group and then select Cloud Business App. A Cloud Business App is a LightSwitch application designed to run against SharePoint. We will then be prompted to enter our SharePoint development website. After doing that, the project will be created. The first project in the solution will be the configuration project, which also contains the deployment wizard. The second project is the HTML client project, which contains the JavaScript for the LightSwitch screens. Then we have the server project. This is where we'll place our Angular code. And then finally the SharePoint configuration project. First, we'll add a table to the server project. We'll add a to-do table. We will then wire up the validate method, and we'll use the following code. This code will only allow a person to create a task where the task is not named new task. Also, they can only have one task that is incomplete. In addition, only the person who created a task will be able to modify the task. We would then wire up the deleting method, and we'll implement business logic that says that only the person who created the task can delete the task. Let's look at a demonstration. We'll expand the server project. We'll right-click on data sources and add new table. We'll add the to-do table. We'll create the task name field and the is complete field, and this will be a Boolean field. We will then select Write Code and Validate, and enter our validation code covered earlier. We'll also select Write Code and the deleting method, and we'll implement the deleting code. We will now create the HTML client screens. We will right-click on the Screens folder and select Add Screen. We'll then use a common screen set, which will automatically create CRUD screens, and for the screen data that we select, in this case we'll select the to-dos table. The CRUD screens will automatically be created. We would then debug the application. It will connect to our SharePoint development site, and it will upload our manifest to the SharePoint development site. It will then ask us to trust the application, and the application will then run. Let's look at this in Visual Studio. This is the application where we left it. We'll expand the HTML client node, and we'll select Add Screen on the Screens folder. We'll then select the common screen set, and we'll select our data, the to-dos table. We'll click OK, and LightSwitch will automatically create the screens. Of course, we can edit these screens as needed. We can then click Start to debug the application. We'll be prompted to log into our SharePoint development site, and the manifest will be uploaded, and we'll log into SharePoint, and we'll have to trust the application. At this point, the LightSwitch application will run, and CRUD screens to allow us to add, edit, and delete records will have been created, and we can go ahead and enter some records. We'll need this data to later test the Angular application. We will now create the AngularJS application. First, on the server project, we will right-click on it and select Manage NuGet Packages. We will then install AngularJS. We will also install JData. JData is a free open source library that is optimized to work with both Angular and LightSwitch. We will then add a Pages folder and a JavaScript file. We'll call the JavaScript file JDataCrud. We will also add an ASPX page called JDataCrud. Angular only requires an HTML page. However, the reason why we're using an ASPX page is that we want the page to be set as the startup page for the project. Currently, Visual Studio only allows you to set an ASPX page as a startup page. Let's look at this in Visual Studio. We'll right-click on the server project and we'll select Manage NuGet Packages. We will then select the AngularJS package and we'll go ahead and install it. This will install the Angular, JavaScript, and CSS files into our project. We'll then select JData. JData will then also be added to our server project. We'll then create a folder called Pages. This just allows us to put our Angular pages in one place. We'll add a JavaScript file called JDataCrud. This will talk to JData, which then talks to the LightSwitch OData service layer. We'll then create a page called JDataCrud ASPX, and this is the front end code. We would then go into the SharePoint configuration and we will set the JDataCrud page to load. Let's look at this in Visual Studio. We'll expand the SharePoint configuration and under Start Page we'll select the JDataCrud page that we created. At this point we'll run the application. We'll log into our SharePoint development website. We'll have to trust the application because the manifest changed. And now instead of the LightSwitch application loading, the Angular application will load. We'll see any existing tasks that we created with the LightSwitch application, and we'll be able to create new tasks. We'll see that the business rules that we created earlier will still run. This is the advantage of using LightSwitch as your backend for your Angular applications. We can select an existing task and we can edit it or delete it. Now we'll match the styles of the SharePoint site. To do this, we simply use boilerplate code that we add to the ASPX page. Now the look goes from this to this. We will now add the SharePoint Chrome, which is the logo and toolbar. To do this, we have a much larger piece of code. However, again, it's boilerplate code that you can then customize. You can download this code from the lightswitchhelpwebsite.com. And now when we run our application, it looks like this. Also, we can switch to the LightSwitch application to see the original screens. Let's look at this in Visual Studio. When we run the application and sign in to our SharePoint website, we see that the styling does not really match SharePoint. If we add the boilerplate code to the ASPX file and then we run the application, we'll see that it matches the styling of the SharePoint website. Let's now look at the toolbar. Right now, there is no toolbar. We'll return to the application and we will add a script called Chrome Loader. We will then alter the ASPX page to load the Chrome Loader script. This is mostly boilerplate code. However, you can customize Chrome Loader to add your own links. Now when we run the application, we'll see the toolbar. Now we will cover how you can post to the SharePoint newsfeed. Let's first look at a demonstration. This is our existing application where we last left it. This time, however, when we run the application and we create a new task and then save the task, we'll then be able to navigate to the SharePoint website. We'll then click on our picture and select About Me. We will then see that something has been posted to our activity. We'll click on the link to navigate us back to the Angular application. To do this, we'll first create the project, and we will go into permissions and we will set the tenant write permissions. We will then set the user profile read permissions. We will then go into the to-dos table and wire up to the inserting method and use the following CSOM code to post to the SharePoint newsfeed. This code is normal CSOM code that you'll find in the SharePoint documentation. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll expand the SharePoint configuration and we'll go to Permissions. Under Permissions, we'll first add write permission to the tenant. We'll then select the user profiles and add read permission. We'll then click Save. Now we'll go into the to-dos table and select Write Code and wire up code on the inserting method. You can get the following code from the lightswitchhelp.website.com. However, this code is normal CSOM code that you'll find in the normal SharePoint documentation. In order for the code to run, we have to add some using statements and also some DLL references. We will now cover creating Word documents in SharePoint. Let's look first at the final project. When we run the project, we'll log into our SharePoint website. We'll sign in. We'll trust the application. And our to-dos list will show. When we add a task and hit Save, and then go back to the task, we'll see at the bottom there is now a document. We can click Direct Link to open it up in Word, or we can click the link to open it up in Word Online. We'll see that a document has been created, and dynamic text with the document's name has also been added to the document. We can then edit the document. This edits it in Word Online. This really is Microsoft Word. To demonstrate this, we'll actually add additional text. We'll even insert some clip art. In this case, we'll search for a light switch. We'll select the light switch and we'll add it to the document. We're doing this just to demonstrate that this really is Microsoft Word. running in the web browser. When we return back to our SharePoint site and then navigate to the document collection, we'll first select Site Contents and then we'll select Task Documents. We'll see that the document that was created actually resides in the SharePoint site. The first step is to add references. We will first download and install the OpenXML SDK 2.5 from Microsoft Office. This will allow us to dynamically create Microsoft Word documents. We will then add a reference in our server project. We will also add a reference to Windows Base. We will make sure that we set copy local to true for the OpenXML library. You must do this in order for it to actually work when you publish your application. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll expand the server project, we'll expand references, we'll right click and select Add Reference. We'll select Extensions, and the OpenXML library that we installed will then show up. You'll want to select the most recent version. In addition, you'll select Framework and select Windows Base. After the references have been added, you'll click on the OpenXML and select Copy Local to True. We would then add a Task ID property field to the to-do table. We're doing this so that we can associate a to-do item with documents in the SharePoint document library that we're going to create in the next steps. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll expand the server project, we'll expand the Data Sources node, and we'll select the to-dos table. We'll open it up and we'll just simply add a Task ID field. We'll set it to be string and we'll set required to false, and we'll save the table. Now we will connect LightSwitch to the SharePoint document library. To do this, we log into our SharePoint site and we select Add an App. We select the document library app, which allows us to create a document library, which we will call Task Documents. We will then go into the settings of the Task Documents library that we just created, and we will go to Create Column, and we will create a Task ID column. Let's look at that in SharePoint. We'll first select Site Content and select Add an App. We'll select the document library app and create a document library called Task Documents. Now this will allow us to add documents such as the Word documents that we need. However, we'll need to connect those documents to our Angular application, so we'll need to create a field. This is why we're creating a field called Task ID. We'll create the field and click OK. Now, to connect our application to this document library, we will right-click on Data Sources in the server project and select Add Data Source. We will then select SharePoint as our data source, and we'll specify our development site. It'll ask us to log in, and we'll select the Task Documents library. We will also select the User Information List, which allows us to get data on a user so that we have their name rather than just their user ID. The document library and the user information list will show up in the data sources in the server project. We will then click the relationship button so that we can associate the to-dos table with the task document library, joining on the task ID, which is now in both tables. The relationship will show. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll expand the server project, the data sources folder. We'll right-click on the data sources folder and we'll select Add Data Source. We'll select SharePoint as a data source, specify our development website. We'll of course have to log in, and we're basically going to then select Document Libraries and the Task Documents library. Now note, when we deploy the site to our production website, it will simply look for a document library called Task Documents. The Task Document library will show, and now we'll create a relationship to our to-do table. The two data sources will be joined on the task ID field that we created in both data sources. After we create the relationship, it will then show. We will now cover creating the Word document. We will wire up to the to-dos inserting method, and we'll use the following SharePoint CSOM code that will dynamically create the Word document and dynamically add text. It will also upload the Word document to the SharePoint site and then associate the current to-do task with the document on the task ID. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll expand the server project. We'll then go into the to-dos table, select Write Code and the inserting method. At this point, we'll be calling the OpenXML DLL that we added earlier. You can get this code on the lightswitchhelpwebsite.com. As you see, we'll need to add using statements for OpenXML. This code will create the document, upload it to SharePoint, and then associate it with the to-do. We will now update the AngularJS application. First, we'll add a call through OData to the document library OData feed in the application to only show documents that are associated with the current task ID. We will then alter the markup in the Angular application to show the associated document with the currently selected to-do item. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll expand the server project. We'll go to the pages to go to our Angular pages. We'll go to the Angular JavaScript page. Now it's important to understand that because we create the relationship in the LightSwitch backend, for the Angular code we simply have to just show the documents that will be related. When we run the application, we create a new task, save it, and then select that task. We see that the document has been created. However, at this point we don't have any links. However, if we look in the task document library, we'll see the document. We will now create a link so that the users can click on the document and then open it up in Microsoft Word Online in the SharePoint site. We can get the link that can be used by looking at the OData feed in the application and looking at the read link property. We can then create an Angular filter that when passed a document URL and a document name will create a link to open that document in Word Online in SharePoint. We will then alter the Angular application to consume the filter and display a link. Let's look at that in Visual Studio. We'll expand the server project and we'll go into the Angular page. First we'll go into AngularJS page and we'll add the filter. We'll then go into the markup page and we'll add markup code that will call the filter. Now when we run the application, we create a new task, we save it, and then select the task. We'll see the document's been created, and we now have links that when we click on them will allow us to see and edit the document. You can get all the code covered here on the LightSwitchHelpWebsite.com. You can also order my book on the LightSwitchHelpWebsite.com.